Sir? Well, I got good news and bad news for tonight. The bad news is I didn't have time to put together a PowerPoint slide, so we're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. So get out your swords and we'll use those. The good news is you don't have to put up with it anymore. This will be my last class. So. But we're kind of nearing the end of our study of Luke. It's been a great class. I want to thank everybody for their attendance and participation, for Brad and Derek and William as well. I really enjoyed it. And we started off, one of the first questions I asked was if this was anybody's favorite gospel, and we'll see how that goes towards the end. Well, it's getting there. It's getting there. I'd say John might still edit it out for me, but this has been a really good study, and I appreciate everybody's participation. So tonight we're going to start in verse 29, pick up where we left off last time, and ideally we'll make it through verse 38 of chapter 22. But please, your comments, questions, and participation as we go along. You recall we left off last time, we were talking about when they were in the temple setting, and the disciples were remarking at how beautiful the temple was, how grand it was, how impressive it was, everything that went into making it just that. Remember all the gold and the pristineness of it all. And then Jesus uses that opportunity to say, well, don't get used to it. It's not gonna be here for much longer. The time is coming when one stone's not going to be left upon another. So the disciples asked him two questions in relation to that comment. What were those questions?
When did it happen?
Yeah, when? What was the other question? Yeah, what are the signs in which it takes place? And Matthew adds a coming, or another question, which is the coming of the end of the age, a sign of the coming of the end of the age. But yeah, so when is this going to happen in relation to the destruction of the temple, and what are going to be the signs that that's ultimately going to come about? And so Jesus kind of talks about that, but he starts off doing so in reverse order, kind of starting with right before it happens. Here's some things that are going to come down the pipe. And we're talking about the persecution and the strife that's just going to be going on in the world. Those are bad things that are going on, but that's not the time under consideration. But verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. We talked about how Luke here, speaking to a Gentile audience, and really just explaining that for us, because Matthew and Mark, they utilize the Daniel passage from Daniel throughout Daniel 9, 7, and 12, talking about the abomination of desolation. When you see that's when you know all these things are about to come down the pipe. But Luke elaborates on it and tells us that's when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem. And when you see that, what are you supposed to do? Run. Get out of town, because you do not want to be in Jerusalem when these things come to pass. When verses 25 through 28, when Jesus comes in judgment and his revealing, as it said in chapter 17, when he is revealed in his power and position at the right hand of the Ancient of Days, another allusion back to Daniel chapter 7. Then picking up in verse 29, he said this several times throughout the gospel thus far about being aware. I mean, the whole passage, you could say, is about trusting in Christ and knowing that he's in control. And there's several of these allusions that we've talked about that are back to Daniel. And for those of you that are in the Daniel class that we had a couple of trimesters ago, what would you say, or if you weren't, what's the overarching theme of the book of Daniel?
Just a bunch of figures that you got to be able to explain.
That's towards the end of it, yes. But I mean, just generally speaking, the whole book, right? The first, it's kind of divided up into two halves, generally speaking. The first 6 chapters are really about Daniel's life, and then the second half is about the prophetic pieces, like Bob was mentioning. But just generally, what's the overall theme of Daniel?
There being a remnant.
A remnant? Yeah, that's definitely a piece of it, that God will cause there to be a remnant. I'd say that's probably more elaborated on with Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but that's definitely a piece of it. Not the one I'm looking for. I guess I opened up two too open of a question.
Most high rules in the kingdoms of men.
Ben was one of the other teachers in that class. He's cheating, yeah. That God is, I'll say it in a different way, God is in control, right? And not only is God in control, but God is in control despite the appearance of present circumstances, right? I mean, just taking it from at face value from Daniel's life. You know, Daniel is a well-to-do Judean. He was somebody of some import, or would have been, but where is he when that book kicks off? Is he in his high place back in Jerusalem and Judea? Where is he? He's in Babylon, right? He's a captive.
Jail, isn't he?
Not pretty much, right? I mean, he's a captive in a foreign land. I mean, not only is he not in any initial position of prominence, he's just a captive to a foreign group. So it would very easily appear to the naked eye that God's not in control. I'm not where I'm supposed to be. But overarchingly throughout the book, you see that time and time again, God is in control. God, and just in the first chapter, puts Daniel in positions to succeed with his captors. He goes to Babylon U and gets a first-rate education that he uses to further his place up to being with the right hand of Nebuchadnezzar and then the kings that follow Nebuchadnezzar. But God is in control despite what seems to be happening, and that's exactly what's going on here. Despite what you think you see and how you might interpret it, God is in control. And that carries over into chapter 22, which we'll read tonight. Jesus and God are firmly in control despite what's about to take place over the next 24 hours, right? But he's calling on his disciples, those following him, to pay attention to what's going on around them. So in verse 29, he spoke to them a parable saying, look at the fig tree and all the trees. And when they are already budding, and you see and you know for yourselves that summer is also near. So also when you see these things, all the things that he's spoken about, know that the kingdom of God is near. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. So again, in verse 32, that some of you present listening to this will not pass away until these things come to pass. So you can trust that this is going to come about. Heaven and earth might pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. That could be just a general statement about the security of the words, or the heaven and earth under consideration there might be the entirety of the Jewish system that are going to ultimately pass away in the coming years. But Christ's words will by no means pass away. So what are you going to put your faith in? What Jesus has told you, or what you see around you? And then you're going to let that sway you and lead you one direction or another, like we'll see with Judas in a few verses. But take heed to yourselves, verse 34, lest your hearts be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and cares of this life, and that day come upon you unexpectedly. For it will come as a snare on those who dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch therefore, and pray always that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. And in the daytime he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and he stayed on the mount called Olivet. Then early in the morning all the people came to hear him, or came to him in the temple to hear him. So again, he makes the reference to pay attention. Don't let yourselves get swayed one way or another, not only by the terrible things that might be going on around you, but also just not by things that are of a distracting nature, right? Drunkenness or carousing, or just generally speaking, the cares of this life that might come upon you that cause this day, or you to miss this day, or the signs of this day that are coming about, because it will act as a trap or a snare, that says in verse 35, for those who aren't paying attention. But he calls on his disciples to be watching and to be praying so that they can make their way through them. And then the verses 37 and 38 are kind of this ominous allusion to everything that's about to take place. Luke makes reference that in the daytime, he was always in the temple and he was teaching, but at night he was out and saying in the Mount Olivet. Likely kind of an allusion. This is around the Passover time, which we're about to find out. So this is where Jesus was staying, and probably staying in a somewhat secret way, right? Because he knows there's treachery afoot even within his own group, and so it's something of a secret where he stays at night. But in the daytime, he was always in the temple, and that kind of comes about at the end of chapter 22. At the end of chapter 22, verse 53, whenever he is arrested by the priests and the temple police that come to get him, he says, "When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." So they're operating under the cover of darkness after having been betrayed by Judas. But that's their whole MO, right? Is the things that they're going to do are going to be. I remember Jim Ward preached a sermon years ago, and I wrote it down. It said, "Sins are like mushrooms; they grow in the dark." Right? That's how these men were acting. These whitewashed tombs. They were doing things in secret when they didn't think anyone was paying attention. Ultimately, they weren't going after him in the temple because they feared the people, as we'll read in the next couple of verses. And why did they fear the people?
People probably would oppose what they were doing.
Why? You're right. Why would they oppose what the chief priest would do?
Well, they're being oppressed by the chief priests, by the leaders, and so they see Jesus, in my opinion, they see Jesus as being drastically different from anything they've experienced, and they want to listen to him. He sounds reasonable. They don't.
Yeah, and he came across and positioned himself as the Messiah, right? I mean, when he was making his way into Jerusalem, the triumphal entry back in chapter 19, people were intrigued by him, so much so they were lining the streets and crying out his name. So they're intrigued by this one. And if the chief priests, the leaders of the day, were to just snatch him up right in the middle of the temple while he's doing what? What's he doing there? Teaching. Right, that wouldn't go over so well with the people, right? And so they were fearful of that. And not only that, but what, as we'll kind of read there in verse 20 or chapter 22, verse 1, what time of year is this? What's going on? Passover. There are a lot of people in Jerusalem at Passover. Yeah, it's one of those 3 pilgrimage feasts, right, throughout the year in which, if you were, a man, you had to come to Jerusalem. If you lived within, I think, was it 15 miles or something, like it was mandated that you had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate these feasts. So Jerusalem just blew up in size around this time. But, Passover, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a second, but Passover is commemorating the entirety of the Exodus event. And what happened? What's the elevator pitch of the Exodus event? No wrong answers here. There's no PowerPoint, so you can say. What is the Passover supposed to represent, or what is the significance of the Exodus? Freedom from bondage. Freedom from bondage? Bondage by whom in Exodus?
By Pharaoh.
By Pharaoh, by Egypt, by this oppressive power, right? What's going on in Jerusalem right now?
Same thing.
Right? Bondage of some foreign oppressive power. So there's a lot of political unrest around this time of Passover. Most of the revolts that would, history can teach us that there were a lot of revolts and uprising around Jerusalem. Nobody wanted to be, from a Roman standpoint, in charge of Judea, because that was just a troublesome assignment. Yeah, right.
When we were looking at, I think last Wednesday, when they're questioning him and Jesus says, was John from God or not? And it says that they reasoned, that if they said that he was from God, he'd be like, well, then why didn't you believe? But if they said that he's from man, they said the people will stone us, which I think kind of speaks to that. They had expectations of what Jesus was, and they were kind of acting on those. He's not going to meet those expectations, because in just a few days, all these people are going to be gone.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be by his side while he's on the cross. They're not going to demand that he gets let go instead of a criminal. So they're all going to disappear in a hurry. But I do think you're right. I mean, they really thought, here's our chance. Here's our chance for the Exodus again. We're going to repeat history, and God's going to save us from this.
Yeah, so Passover just had this It was like just a lipstick of dynamite under the surface. Anything could happen at Passover in Jerusalem. I mean, that's why you had these dignitaries in town. Pilate's in town. Herod is in town. Right? It's a big deal, and so that would be, if there was going to be some sort of unrest, this would probably be the time in which it was most likely to occur. So they want to do this with as much secrecy as they can. All right.
Same time, there was a lot of government, not just the officials, but the military
Yeah.
was there. And, like the man who watched Jesus die and was amazed, this must be the Son of God. He was in charge of several centurions,
Yeah.
so there were a lot of them in town.
Yeah, now this is a big time, right? Josephus records that, I don't think he gives a specific number, but he talks about how that, in one particular Passover, there were over 200,000 lambs slaughtered on Passover, and he records that, a minimum amount of people that one lamb was supposed to be for was 10, sometimes upwards of 20. So, you're talking about 2.5 million people in Jerusalem at this time. So in a city that's normally about the size of 400,000. So, right, this is a big to-dos going on in Jerusalem at this time. All right, verse 1, chapter 22. So now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way, and he conferred with the chief priests and captains how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. And so he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of the multitude. All right, so like I mentioned, we're here in the days of the Passover. Luke gives two names for it: unleavened bread and Passover. They're two, technically speaking, two distinct feasts as prescribed in Leviticus chapter 23. But they're right back to back. One starts on the 14th, or one starts on the 14th, and the next one starts on the 15th. So they go hand in hand. They were just really inseparable with the overall theme of the Exodus and what they're supposed to represent. So that's the stage in which all of this is about to take place. And so the chief priests, as we've already talked about, are looking for a way to take out Jesus. And again, it's just interesting. It's during the Passover that they're looking to do this. And they're trying to do it in a secret way because they feared the people. I don't know if we've talked about it in this particular class, but John relates that the day in which, technically he says the day before Jesus came in was 6 days before the Passover. So that means the day that he came in was on the 10th, right? 5 days before the Passover. That was the day, according to Exodus chapter 12, that the people would have selected the lamb. And the lamb comes into their midst and lives in their home with them for those 5 days. It becomes kind of a part of the family for 5 days, and they would inspect the lamb to make sure it truly was, free of blemish. And that's exactly what's happening to Jesus during this 5-day period, right? He's in the presence of the people every day in the temple. And then right at the very end, Pilate will declare, I find no fault in this man. He has no blemish, right? So the lamb is being inspected by the people leading up to its slaughter, actually on the 14th, between the evenings. But then it says in verse 3 that Satan entered Judas, who was numbered among the 12. So we've got our stage set, and one of the 12 is going to betray him. And that word betray, you can say a lot of things about a person, but if you throw the word betrayal around, that one is kind of one that cuts pretty deep. When you say you've betrayed me, that's one that really sticks. And you see obviously that Satan had a hand in this, but this is not to alleviate Judas of his part in this narrative, because he's already proven himself, not in Luke's gospel, but in the other synoptics and in John, to be one who is a lover of money. And Satan's capitalizing on that, and entering. They're in cahoots with this plan, and so Judas goes to the chief priests and works with them to betray him in the absence of the multitude. So I can make this a lot easier for you guys. You guys are wanting to take him out at night or when there's not a crowd around. I can make that happen. And I think you kind of see this, the rest of the secrecy around where Jesus is staying, and in the next verse, or the next section, he sends Peter and John ahead to prepare, right? So there's a lot of secrecy around exactly where Jesus is going to be at any given point in time, because he knows that the betrayer's in his midst. Yes?
Don't you wonder how, if all that time Judas was thinking, how can I do this? What am I doing? Or, if he was arguing with himself about the right and wrong of it, but still kept going forward. I just wondered if he was conflicted at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can read a lot between the lines, right?
But it's just something that you think, having been his apostle, that there would be some kind of sorrow at what he started to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you say this, if you're even contemplating, maybe there's not a foreknown contemplation, but if you're going to betray someone, how do you feel towards that person?
You know what?
Right? You don't like them. And now Judas has followed Jesus around for years, and they call each other friend, right? But you got to wonder if maybe Judas is also just angry at Jesus for not fitting what he had expected of the Messiah. He followed him around for 3 years, and now you're just going to die? No. Yeah, John.
Some people have noticed that it's Judas Iscariot. Iscariot means he's from Kerioth, which is in way south Judah. And that places him as being the only apostle that wasn't from Galilee. So he was automatically kind of
Something of an outsider.
a little bit of an outsider, and some have speculated that maybe
Never fit in?
He never quite fit in, was a little on the outside, maybe he resented the leadership positions of Peter and the other Galileans. And then you put the money situation, he was in charge of the money bag, and so it's like that kind of gave Satan the opportunity to orchestrate that and tempt him in just the right way.
Yeah.
And remind us that we can be tempted in some ways that we never dreamed possible, but can have disastrous consequences as well.
Yeah, that's another interesting piece. Maybe Luke doesn't record it for us, but the sum of money that he's betrayed for is how much?
30 pieces of silver.
Right, in the grand scheme of things, that's not that much money. I don't mean just because we're talking about Jesus. I just mean that's the price of a slave. Right? I mean, Judas has probably picked more money out of the money bag that he was, taken in charge of over the course of his following Jesus around. But, and then obviously, after he does this, there is some sickening feeling of, I don't know if he fully contemplated what he did as far as killing the Messiah or his hand in that, but at least just killing an innocent man who didn't deserve it. But nonetheless, Jesus will say to him, woe to him whose hand is in this. That being Judas. All right. So then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." And so they said to him, "Where do you want us to prepare?" And he said to them, "Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of that house, 'The teacher says to you, where is the guest room, where I meet of the Passover with my disciples?' Then he will show you a large furnished upper room. There make ready." So they went and they found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. What all's involved in the preparation of the Passover? Is that something you can... What's that?
Definitely has to be a lamb.
Have to have the lamb. So that's one of the things they have to go do, right, is get a lamb and take it to the temple, have it slaughtered, roast it, have it prepared. What else? Got to have the bitter herbs, right? Yeah, that's got to remember it was a symbolic representation of the bitterness of their time in Egypt. That they're supposed to eat the lamb with bitter herbs and what else? And unleavened bread, right? So they've got quite the to-do list to go into town and to get ready. And again, he just sent the two of them to go do this. Again, I think probably because of the element of secrecy around where this is supposed to take place. I don't know whether Jesus pre-arranged these things or whether this is just divinely happening, that all this stuff was just falling into place to be ready. But in any case, you go in and you see, I always thought, wouldn't there be a bunch of guys walking around Jerusalem carrying pitchers of water? But probably not, right? That would be something of an odd thing, because every time you read in Scripture about people getting water, who is it? It's right. It was the woman's work to go do that, go to the well and fetch the water. So a man walking around would kind of stick out like a sore thumb. That's your guy. Follow him where he goes and ask him to take you to the room. And so they do, and they find everything just as Jesus had said it would be. All right. So they go off and they make these preparations. They find the room and they get ready to have this feast now. Now, just from a timing element perspective, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but Luke says here that this is the day in which the Passover is supposed to be killed. But there's a little bit of a timing discrepancy with John's gospel, who the next day will say or when Jesus is in the praetorium, being on trial, the Jews don't want to go in there because they don't want to be defiled, because they want to do what? Eat the Passover. Which one is it, right? Well, I think Josephus talks about this, and the Mishnah talks about this, that those in Galilee of the Gentiles, right? There's a region that had been Hellenized to a certain degree. So Josephus talks about that those up north had transitioned their calendar to be more along the lines of the Roman calendar, that the day begins at sunrise. It goes sunrise to sunrise. And Lawrence talked to us last week, from a Jewish perspective, what's a day? Yeah, sunset to sunset. So that effectively moves everything forward a day. So those in Galilee would actually reckon the Passover, the 14th, and the slaughtering of the lamb to be a day earlier than what John does. John's kind of looking at it from a Judean or a Sadducean chief priest perspective, which has that day be the following day. So that's just one way to maybe reconcile those, if you've ever caught that little difference. Nonetheless, verse 14, the hour had come, and he sat down with his 12 apostles with him, and he said to them, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. We've talked about it several times leading up to this, right? How about Jesus was focused and steadfastly set his face toward Jerusalem, towards his mission. And he knew good and well what was coming, over the course of the next 12 hours. Yet he still fervently looked toward this particular meal that he would have with his disciples. I think that says a lot about Christ and what he was wanting, because he's got so much packed into this particular meal and the Passover and what it all is ultimately supposed to represent. Verse 16, for I say to you that I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took the cup and he gave thanks and said, take this and divide it amongst yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined. But woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. And then they began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. Do you notice in the Passover Seder that they're observing here something missing? We talked about some of those elements that they had to get from a preparation standpoint.
There's no meat.
There's no lamb, right? No lamb is being consumed, at least from a textual statement. I think there was, but why do you think it's not referenced?
Well, because Jesus is going to be the lamb.
Yeah, all right. Jesus is that Passover lamb. So we talked about it. The whole idea of the Passover and what it's supposed to be. It was one of in Leviticus chapter 23, it refers to it as a holy convocation. Right, or a holy assembly. The Hebrew word is mikra, and what the word can literally mean is a rehearsal. And when you think of rehearsal, what do you think of? Practice, right? Right. But when we look at the Old Testament text, mainly in Exodus chapter 12, and the establishment of the Passover, it was always about looking back, right? Because it started off with questions that were, why are we doing this? Right, and that's not only from the Seder, the Haggadah, how they actually take part of it today, but also, God says, hey, when your children ask you, why do we do this? What are you supposed to tell them?
Why do we do it?
Yeah, why do we do this Passover? Why are we?
To commemorate Jesus' blood.
No, from the Passover, from the Jewish perspective.
Oh,
Yeah, to remember what God did for them and releasing them of bondage and freeing them out of Egypt and the actual, the 10th plague coming upon the land, God just dismantling Egypt and her gods and really proving himself to be the all-in-charge authority and power, and especially having his peculiar people set apart for his special purpose. That's what it's ultimately supposed to represent. I mean, there was a looking back at what God had done. Right? But the word mikra means rehearsal. And when you think rehearsal, you think of practice. That's looking forward to something, right? Practicing for the real thing, right? If you think about your dress rehearsal for a play or something like that, or going to some kind of a sports practice, you're getting ready for a future game, right? So that you'll be ready for the real thing. Well, this is the real thing. Right? Now it's actually coming to pass. There is no more rehearsal. This is it. It's showtime now. And he takes these, Luke is the only gospel writer who actually refers to 2 cups, right? You've got in Luke here, you've got cup, bread, cup. The whole Passover feast actually revolved around 4 different cups. I probably don't have time to go into great detail on this. There's a really good video. It's a group called Jews for Jesus, and if you just Google Jews for Jesus Passover, there's a really good video of them walking through what a Seder is, how it operates, how it functions, what are all the different elements of it, and really how Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of it. That's what I was going to show if I had time, or in case this entire thing of no PowerPoint bombed. But I would encourage you to go do that. It's only about a 45-minute video, but it's really good, and I think goes through in very good detail what all these different pieces are. But the second cup, the first cup, which I think has been referenced here in verse 17, it says, "Take this and divide it amongst yourselves." That was the cup of judgment, and so he's sharing it amongst his disciples, and I think we'll come back to that in just a second. But then the bread that's broken, I think, is in reference to a part of the Seder, which is called the retrieval of the afikomen, which is this bread that is broken and goes off and is hidden, and one of the kids goes off and finds it and brings it back. And then when it gets brought back, it's broken and shared with them. But now Jesus is changing the purpose and the description behind all of these elements and what they really mean. He says, "Take and eat, for this is my body. Do this in remembrance of me." And the cup after supper, verse 20, was the which one was that? It was the cup of sanctification after supper. And then the fourth and final cup, which isn't mentioned here, but it was the cup of praise, where they would sing the Hallel together. And the final cup set aside for Elijah, right? So they'd open the door at the very end of the Seder, and hope that Elijah would just walk through the door and usher in the Messianic age as the forerunner of the Christ. But we know that the Elijah who has already come, and that was John the Baptist. But he's again saying this is not a cup that is supposed to cause you to look back, but this cup is a new covenant, right? A new covenant is being established, right? A covenant was in a sense established between God and the people in that whole Exodus event, and establishing them as his peculiar people for his particular purpose. But here Jesus says this is a new covenant. And that's a reference to Jeremiah chapter 31, right, in which God says that, "Behold, the days are coming which I will make a new covenant with my people, and I will do what?"
Write my words on their hearts, remember their sins no more.
Write my law on their hearts, remember their sins no more, right? So this is that new covenant that Jesus is ushering in. But along with all that, he stops there in verse 21 and says, "But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table." Yeah, Gloria.
Just seeing that what you're talking about here, these are all traditions, though, that have developed over time, because when you look back at Exodus, there's not even any wine mentioned there
Yeah.
on that day.
Yeah,
So that wasn't part of the original Passover
yeah. No,
at
that's a good
all.
point. And it's more, even more, right? And ironically, and again, if you watch the video, I think it's very interesting, but even the additions over the last, 2,000 years are still fulfilled by Christ. It's so special exactly how that takes place. But yeah, no, very, very good. Yeah, those different traditions that were added onto it from that first Passover with Exodus, but they all fit perfectly with what Jesus was. Then the betrayer is among them, and he tells them that, and so they all start to, wait a second. So he's now kind of let the cat out of the bag that there is a betrayer among the 12. So they all start questioning, who is it? Is it I? Is it I? Is it I? And he'll tell Judas in one of the other Gospels that when they dip the sop, when they dip the bread and he gives it to him, that what you're about to do, go and do quickly. So they're questioning, they're trying to figure out who that is. But as Luke records it, at least, that the whole questioning about which one of us is going to betray him turns into what?
Who's the greatest?
Right? It turns into the, well, it's not me. I know, right? I think there's probably two people around the table who knew it wasn't them. Peter and Judas. Peter's like, no way. No way that would be me, right? And then Judas knows it's him. But it's probably good that Peter didn't know it was Judas, because that would have ruined the whole thing. But yeah, verse 24, there was this great dispute among them as to which of them would be the greatest. And you can imagine the frustration and the disappointment in Jesus when this breaks out, because he knows good and well what awaits for him in just the next few hours now. And here they are arguing about their position. Probably got it kicked off around not only the dispute about which of them would betray him, but also the pecking order and the seating situation at this particular feast. And if you kind of look through the other Gospels, it was probably the two, we talked about this before, but those seated close to the host of the feast were supposed to be the ones in the positions of honor, and the ones that go further away were less so. But it was probably, ironically, John and Judas who were sitting on his two sides, his right and his left hand. But they started arguing about which of them is the greatest, and of course, Jesus uses that as an opportunity to rebuke them for thinking that way, and that the Gentiles, the kings of the Gentiles, exercise lordship over them, and those that they exercise authority over, they call themselves benefactors, right? So the rulers of the day, when they rule, they do it solely for themselves, so that they are the ones who are benefiting from it, not the ones who they are supposed to be serving in a leadership capacity. They use that position of authority for their own benefit, for their own gain. But verse 26, that's not how it is supposed to be with you all, because that's not how it's been with me. Right? We've said it several times, every class. Luke chapter 6, verse 40, the disciple is not above his teacher. When he is perfectly trained, he will be like his teacher. This is another one of those trainings, because he says, that's not how it's been with me. When you see someone seated at the table, who's the greatest? Is it the one sitting and being served, or is it the servant? He says, well, it's obviously the one who's being served, but I have always been among you in a position of servitude, of authority, but with service. And we don't have this again here recorded in Luke, but in John's Gospel it goes into a lot of detail about Jesus doing what at this feast? Serving in what way?
Washing their feet.
Yeah, putting a towel on and getting on his hands and knees and washing their feet, right? Doing this lowliest of tasks. And that he's doing that as an illustration to them. You are supposed to be like me in this sense, serving those that you are going to have authority over. Because he doesn't take that away from them, right? He goes on to say, place. Verse 30, that you're going to eat and drink at my table in the kingdom, and you're going to sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. You have special places. You have special places of authority. But that doesn't mean you're supposed to lord it over those. If you're arguing about who's the greatest, then you have that mindset and that inclination to be one who would lord it over someone else. But you're supposed to be like the youngers, serving the elders, and serving and leading in that capacity, in that way. He says, you are those who have been with me in my trials. So he rebukes them, but then lifts them up right after that. You have been with me, and that's what you need to focus in and hone in on the way you have lived and the way you have been with me. And then he turns to Peter in verse 31, and he says, Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you that he may sift you as wheat. A sifting of wheat was another one of those kind of women's work things that really was not terribly difficult manual labor. It was manual labor, but nothing difficult. So in a sense, Jesus is saying, Satan's asked to sift you like wheat because it's going to be easy. Right? It is not going to be hard to do. And what's Peter's response to that?
He would die with him.
Yeah, it's like he takes offense to it, right? That certainly no, that's not how it's going to be. I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. And then how does Jesus respond to that?
Before the rooster crows, you will deny me.
Yeah, you will deny me, 3 times that you even know who I am. I don't want to steal from Brad's thunder. I think talking about that on Sunday, so I'll leave that to him. But he says to him, when you have, in verse 32, I don't want to skip over this. I pray that your faith should not fail, and then when you have returned to me, strengthen your brethren. All right, so it seems like Jesus knows that you're going to have a lack of courage, but that doesn't mean you're going to lose your faith. You're going to go through this. But when I like how he says to him, he starts off the section, Simon, Simon, which was his old name, talking about how he's going to act according to his old ways. But then he closes there at the end, calling him Peter again, calling him the rock, Cephas, right? That you are going to come back, and when you do, don't let that falling, that tripping, that failing hold you down. Don't let it define you. Get back up and strengthen your brethren when you return to me. And then 35 through 38 are kind of a difficult passage from an interpretation standpoint, but it kicks off. He refers back to how things were back in the good old days, right, when they were kicking all this off back in chapter 9 and chapter 10. He says, do you remember when I sent you 12 off, and then I sent out the 70 off to go preach the gospel, to keep the coming of the kingdom of heaven? He's like, remember all that? Oh yeah, that was good stuff. He's like, did you lack anything? Remember I told you not to take anything with you when you go out on those trips? Like, yeah. He's like, well, did you lack anything? I told you not to take money. I told you not to take an extra cloak. I told you not to take a sleeping bag, that you'd be provided for, that you'd be taken care of. Did you lack anything? What's their answer? No, right? That was kind of one of the funny things that we recall back in chapter 9 and chapter 10, that they talked about how great it was when they came back, and they immediately wouldn't feed the 5,000 because we can't do it. We don't have enough. And his whole point was, no, you had enough. But now he's saying, days are coming where you need to take your money back. You need to take the knapsack. You need to take your cloak. You need to take a sword. Because, as he's already said, the times are coming when people are going to hate you for being a child of mine, for being with me, being associated with me. So you need to be ready for that. I don't think he meant that you need to get a sword to protect yourself. God is still going to be with you, but the way you interacted with people in the past is not going to be as good as that going forward. You need to be prepared for that. You need to be ready for it. But then they, of course, take it, I think, out of context, and they say, well, we got swords. And he's like, all right, that's enough. All right, and that's where we'll pick up on verse 39 on Sunday. Thank you all.